Right. This is the Convention of Cintra. Again, sort of like going, we will go and do the health warnings first. It's again sort of going, please bring an open mind. I'm presenting the facts. Sir Arthur Wellesley, who through the eyes of him and Oman, is really how we actually see the Convention of Cintra. The other part, which is missed upon many authors, is that there are actually 3 treaties for Cintra. So we must put things into context. Britain dealt with a naval strategy. It wasn't about the army, it was about the navy. And it was all about maintaining a naval superiority over France. So after Tilsit, you've got a race for France to get more ships, because of they'd all been destroyed, or a lot of them captured, etc., at Trafalgar. So again, sort of going, the first place was, of course, Copenhagen. Then you've got the Portuguese Navy escapes to Brazil in 1807. The Russian fleet is actually, the Mediterranean fleet is actually in Lisbon. Then you've got the Spanish fleet were ordered to Toulon. And then you've got Walcheren, where again, sort of going, it was a very successful raid in naval terms on Walcheren, which some people will no doubt shout me down about. But the main part was to protect her trade, Britain's trade. Now, this is an interesting thing. I mean, again, sort of like going, it was the realization that we captured 76 Danish ships. 41 were added to the Royal Navy. Again, it's about opening new markets. New markets. The Spanish had monopoly over South America with the Portuguese in Brazil. So you again sort of like going, it's about how do we actually make more money, being that we're the continental system is locking us out of Europe, or attempting to. The Treaty of Fontainebleau. We must remember that Spain always wanted Portugal. They actually had Portugal between 1580 and 1640. And interestingly, that 40% of their galleys were actually Portuguese during the 1588 Spanish Armada. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, this was basically carving up Portugal into parts. The King of Etruria was actually ejected by Napoleon, and again sort of going, he was looking for a place to actually go and give him some land, or give him a place and so forth to actually go and move to. The Etruria became the Kingdom of Italy, of course. You've got the central part, which is in yellow, and this was in effect sort of going, that was going to be French, because you've got the main port, the most important port of Lisbon, which was a deep water port where you could actually stage a fleet for an invasion of Britain, potentially. And the other part of it was that there were 3 divisions for the invasion from Spain. The situation for Portugal was in a very, very poor state, because they had actually asked for assistance from Britain, but we were not in any ability to actually go and do anything. We had troops in Sicily, we had troops in South America coming back, and we had none of the disposable force that was available to actually go and give them even a couple of thousand men. So the only option was to move the government and the royal family to Brazil. This was tremendously well planned and goes against everything that you've probably read about it as being very hasty and so forth. It also, all the serviceable warships and so forth were now in Brazil. Yes, there were left 13 unseaworthy warships, but these were they couldn't go to sea. They were rotting there, need to be rebuilt, etc. The other part, which is he's criticised on Zhao, is saying do not resist. But again, sort of going, the French were renowned for their reprisals. And they were perfectly willing to hang, guillotine and shoot anybody that stood in their way. And the other important thing, which again sort of going comes in for the importance of trade, is about the garrisoning of Madeira. Madeira is just off West Africa. And again, sort of going, it's an important port to actually for trade going round the Cape of Good Hope or going across to South America or Central America. As you can see here, this is the directest route to Lisbon. This is not the way you should invade Portugal, as clearly shown. Junot started with 25,000 French. He had an additional about 10,000 from the Spanish, and by the time he actually left Salamanca, which is about here, he practically had no cavalry left because he was moving too fast. Remember, cavalry and horses need to be looked after, and you can't keep marching weeks on end and so forth and expect the cavalry and the horses and so forth to survive. So on the 30th of November, he arrived in Lisbon with only 1,500 emaciated men. I mean, that is an incredible sort of 94% attrition just on the French alone. Interestingly, the nearest artillery was actually Spanish horse artillery that got to about Santarém at the time, escorted by Spanish hussars. So the French cavalry were actually sort of way back here, and eventually they were transported down the river. The Russian Navy was in Lisbon. That seems very strange to most people. But at the time, you've got sort of going back sort of 3 or 4 years, the Turkey and Russia, for one of the few times in their histories, were actually friends. So the Baltic and the Crimean fleet could actually get out into the Mediterranean and join up. Russia had a sizable fleet there, and this was the remnants. They had something in excess of 30-odd warships, and again, that's all documented in our book. And again, sort of going, they were down to only 9 warships, 700 guns, and 5,700 sailors. So it's still a significant part, but they were strangely an unwilling ally of France. And again, sort of going, it is probable that the Tsar chose that to make sure, sort of going, he kept distance from the French, because again, we're talking about just after Tilsit. Napoleon's plans for Spain. Remember, they were a French ally. This is really sort of stabbing them in the back. And you've also got, remember that there was allowance of having troops in Spain from Fontainebleau Treaty. Now, there was 100,000 French, which was 2.5 times what was allowed, already in Spain before they started. Then you've got the Spanish army outside Spain. Now, this is a thing that's also missed, in that Romana was the best parts of the Spanish army. That was in Denmark. You had 3 divisions, which were the rest of the movable force that, or mobile force, that the Spanish were in Portugal. There was only 3,000, 4,000 of the Guard in Madrid. And then the rest of the armies were distributed mainly militia, around the coast because of the horrible Royal Navy raiding and so forth. And then, as I earlier said, the Spanish Navy had been ordered to Toulon. So again, sort of going, Napoleon actually let the whole of the Spain and so open to invasion. Again, you've got the Spanish insurrection, Dos de Mayo, Spanish insurrection, and that was put down tremendously hard. And again, sort of going, this is a tremendous, beautiful painting from Goya of that. Now, this was an interesting sort of tie-up between Romana and Wellesley. Romana was stranded in Denmark. He didn't know that there was insurrections going on in his homeland. And it was Wellesley who chose the Roman Catholic priest called Robertson to go and tell Romana what was happening. So that's an interesting sort of tie-up. And again, sort of going, that was another incredible sort of like rescue from the breaches thing for the Royal Navy, where just over 9,000 Spanish were evacuated back to Denmark. The other part, which is interesting, is that the Spanish delegation came over and it was Wellesley who actually entertained them. And it wasn't until the 5th of July, 1808, that peace with Spain was agreed. Now, Sir Arthur Wellesley wasn't the finished article. He was the newest Lieutenant General in line of succession. I think he was at 121 in the list of generals. He'd only just returned in 1805 from India. His force was for Spanish Mexico, thinking about the gold, intersecting the gold that was going to Spain, etc. He was considered suited for colonial warfare. He had not been proven in Europe, really. He had only commanded a brigade. That was the reserve, which is actually light infantry brigade at Copenhagen. And remember, reserve was normally what was actually the force that was actually that was doing the assaulting, and then they would become part of the reserve, and that's how it sort of worked. Now, we touched upon the seniority of generals. Now, that's essential to understand who commands what and who. Which general is above another. And remember, the destination was Spain, wasn't Portugal. You've got a force that Wellesley had of 7,000 men, which was suitable for a lowly lieutenant general. But now you've got a force of 30,000 men, which is you're expecting to have probably 5, 6 lieutenant generals. So you needed a more senior commander. Britain had a limited pool of talent, you could say. I mean, again, that's probably being unfair, maybe. But again, that is all about trying to fit, and we're talking about moving very quickly. All these people had posts. The Duke of York, he had shown himself to be rather poor in the Netherlands, but he was a great reforming commander-in-chief. He was also the son of George III. Earl of Chatham, who later commanded at Walcheren, was Master General Ordnance. And Sir John Moore, which probably would have been premier in their thoughts as commanding the active part of the campaign, was unfortunately in Sweden at the time, with his army of about 10 to 14,000 men. Dalrymple, he was the most senior person there. He had commanded the Northern District, governor of Gibraltar. You don't put an idiot or a foolish person and so forth to govern Gibraltar, because that was the entry port, and you had to keep it to actually have any chance of having a toehold in the Mediterranean. He had close communications with Spain, with a number of their generals. He was an expert in Spanish affairs. And of course, he was the obvious choice for Spain because that's where we were going. Unfortunately, he knew very little about Portugal. Now, Harry Barrard, he was a safe pair of hands. He had been second in command to Cathcart at Copenhagen. He had expertise in light infantry operations and amphibious operations. He probably had the second to Sir John Moore on the expertise in amphibious operations. But again, very little of that has been written about. Wellesley was rejected. He went to Corunna. And again, sort of going, if you run through, so the reasoning is basically going, the Spanish didn't believe that the British were there to help them. They thought they were going to have annexation of their land potentially and so forth. You've got only sort of 3 years before, you've got Trafalgar. And also sort of going, he's turning up with only 9,000 men and 368 cavalry. I mean, that's paltry when you've got, that's going to face over 100,000 French. So he was told, well, Portugal's there, try there. The other part, of course, is Spain and Britain had been at war for the long 18th century. Incredibly, 44% of the time, they were at war with each other. Technically only once as allies, and I've got no record of them actually operating together in 1793 to 96. Also, what was going on at the time was that the Spanish had been tremendously successful. They'd won, in effect, as many times as they'd lost. And in sieges, the French were very poor. As you can see, that they lost 4 out of the 5 sieges. Then you've got this defeat of the French army, where you've got 25,000 men laying down their arms. This destroyed the invincibility of the French army. The sieges of Girona and Zaragoza were lifted. Bessieres, who was on the border of Portugal, had to retreat 130 miles to Burgos. King Joseph in Madrid, who had only just arrived there a few days before, had to quickly retire to Vitoria, which is about 225 miles away. The reaction of Napoleon was to invade with a further 130,000 men. Junot's dilemma. He disbanded the Portuguese army. Horses were transferred to the French because it's disbanded, so it's their property. The best parts of the Portuguese army was forced to join the Portuguese Legion, which was sent to France. In Portugal, the House Braganza was deposed by Napoleon, and on the 1st of February, Junot was created Governor General of Portugal. Again, he was hoping to become king or prince and so forth, but that's what he was wanting to become. The French were already stranded in Portugal. Portugal was ready for revolt. In December, the country was disarmed and hunting was banned. And again, that was a tradition and so forth for them. So they found that affronted by. Tensions boiled over with executions and martial law. You're talking about 50 to 100 people executed over this period. And this is only sort of February, March, April. When the Spanish insurrection occurred, which we've talked about in May, this completely isolated 30,000 men. You're talking about a huge distance across hostile territory back to France. And there was no way of getting any naval or messages and so forth by sea because of the Royal Navy. So on the 7th of June, 1808, Junot received the last dispatch from Napoleon dated 29th of May, 1808. That was actually demanding him to use half his force to be sent into Spain to support the French that were already in there. Some of them actually marched out and had to march back and had real problems actually getting back to their fortresses in Portugal. On the 15th of June, finally, information and so forth, practically the whole of Portugal rose against them. On the 20th of June, all of Portugal had risen against the French, and anybody moving around in anything less than company-sized units and so forth were being attacked. Meanwhile, the Russian fleet stayed neutral. Northern Portugal was lost to the French. And also the Algarve was lost to the French. So you've only got the central part around Lisbon and the few fortresses that were in French hands. The French response was very, very heavy-handed. Mass executions, shooting to quell opposition. Over 4,000 unarmed Portuguese were killed and 4,000 prisoners. So it's again sort of going, they really did heavily try to put down the insurrection. But this did not quell the Portuguese thirst for revenge. There's more that we need to sort of find out about this. And again, we've written as much as we could find available. But again, sort of going, it's very, very quiet. Many of the historians that you would rely upon on what was actually happening in Portugal at the time. Wellesley finally landed on the 1st of August, and this was 100 miles north of Lisbon. Again, sort of going, it took him 5 to 6 days to land his troops. Again, you've got to remember that most of this was landing on open beaches, because there really isn't very much of a port there. This was only a fishing village that he was landing at. Again, sort of going, you think about landing troops and horses and provision in search. I would consider rather dangerous. And certainly they did. There was no specialist landing craft. There was only longboats and rafts. Gunpowder really doesn't work when it's wet. And then it's almost impossible to land a heavy siege gun barrel, which weighs 2 tons. You've got very little chance of actually landing them. And again, if you haven't got the siege guns landed, how are you going to take a fortress? Again, the British went to war without horses. A lot of this is basically because they take up about 10 times as much room as a man. So you've got the problem is that a ship that can take 300 men can barely take 20, 25, maybe 30 horses at most. And again, sort of going, horses are not very willing to be landed through the surf. There was only enough horses for 60 light dragoons. The rest were given to the artillery and pulling whatever the siege train we actually had. 60 light dragoons doesn't go very far, and they were probably outnumbered by the horses for the staff. Again, many historians consider logistics as boring, but it's essential to understand, especially when you're dealing with the peninsula, because all the decisions made by generals and so forth were all about logistics. The campaign in Portugal, I'm not going to go through this, but basically going, we've got there on the 10th of August, marches down the coast. And on the 15th, he's joined by a Portuguese brigade under a very interesting Englishman. But this was 2,375 men, including 300 cavalry. So he now had more Portuguese cavalry than he had mounted British cavalry. But also this was well over half the armed men that Portuguese army had at the time. Again, Wellesley omits their what they did or anything in the various reports. You then got Abydos, which is the 95th Rifles, going into the town and ejecting the French, Rolica, and then Junot defeated at Vimeiro. The Peace of Cintra. Wellesley was chosen to actually negotiate it. He disputes this vehemently in various letters and so forth. But he was the obvious candidate. He had negotiated the Treaty of Copenhagen. Kellerman had actually asked for Wellesley, being unaware that he'd been superseded by Burrard and then Dalrymple. He was known and trusted by the ministers. He was actually an MP. He had proposed the expedition to assist the Spanish. Junot was the commander of the French army in Portugal and was head of state. So Sir Hugh Dalrymple could not be involved because he was in effect at the same level as Junot, and you wanted negotiations between equals. And the other side is sort of going, neither side wanted delays because the British wanted Portugal and the French out as quickly as possible. And Junot wanted to get out of Portugal before his army was murdered by the Portuguese. Now, these are the various quotes and so forth, and there's more in the book that you'll see that what I've said is actually almost certainly the truth. And even Wellesley actually accepted. I might in some points differ. I certainly did advise the concurrence in the evacuation of the French from Portugal, which is probably the most controversial part of the treaty. And also remember that the Peace of Cintra was the basis for the definitive convention. And again, sort of going, you've got two French sources that are agreeing with that. At this time, this is the position that the French were in. Junot was, in effect, he had Elvas and Lisbon and Almeida. That's all he controlled. The Portuguese, which are in green, are advancing, and the British, as you can see, coming into Mondego Bay and are marching down the coast. At the same time, you've got the effect of Bailén, where the French had been forced to evacuate very quickly from Madrid. And you've got Zaragoza. The siege here was abandoned. So you can see that there was no chance whatsoever that Junot could actually walk across Spain to get out to France. But again, he didn't know exactly what was happening because he had no information since June of what was actually happening in Spain. So Junot had some very, very difficult choices. Retire to the fortress and relate relief. Junot was unaware that Napoleon had invaded on the 5th of August with a fresh army of 130,000 men. Fortresses were not fully stocked with provisions because he didn't think about that. Constant attacks from the Portuguese and Spanish would have been on his march back, and the Portuguese would have probably murdered them and any collaborators in the bed. When Moore landed, finally, his field army would have been effectively outnumbered at least 2 to 1 by the British army, and about 3 to 4 to 1 when you take into account the Portuguese. the British landed from all over the place, again, sort of going pulling in. And remember that Sir John Moore, his army was still on ships that had just gone to Sweden and back, so they hadn't even disembarked. So again, you think about the state of the men, let alone the state of the horses. And remember that a horse takes about a week, at least, on land to actually be back to being useful. So the only army that at the time of Vimeiro that was involved was about 17,000 men under Wellesley. The other thing that's always sort of like forgotten is just the sheer amount of ships that were involved and the requirements of transportation and so forth. So you've got 372 ships were involved in landing the 38,000 men that had actually landed. Almeida, it's such an important place. This is the northern invasion route into Portugal, and it controls that. And again, you look at the defences. We didn't have any siege guns. We couldn't get them off the ships. We couldn't get them off the ships until we got Lisbon. You could say, sort of going, this is how not to take fortresses, British style. The need for heavy guns. You need 18-pounders and 24-pounders and mortars. Yes, potentially they were on ships. Actually, the 18-pounders were on the Royal Navy ships on and weren't on travelling carriages. So they're on normal naval truck carriages, which don't go across country. I mean, you're talking about a solid 12-inch wheel, and that's not how they're built. So you're needing sort of 5-foot carriages. So again, sort of going, there's a lot there. There's no siege train as such. And then you've got the slight problem that Wellesley said that there was 24-pounder ammunition, but he didn't actually have any of the correct ammunition for his 18-pounders. So I don't know how that works. Take a huge amount of time to actually blockade. That's the other way. And Napoleon would have been in Lisbon. And this is from his own words, Sir Arthur Wellesley, which basically saying sort of exactly the same here is that it wouldn't, Sir Arthur Wellesley affirmed that the British Army would not be in a condition to reduce the fort till the beginning of December, and then it might be thought advisable to give the French army the same or nearly the same terms as those granted them in August. So he's finally come round to sort of like agree that this was the only course to do, was to give the French a free passage back to France. But also, I think he was extremely hopeful that he might have actually taken a fortress by December. These are a précis of the Convention of Cintra. Article 1, ensure the fortresses were handed over intact. Now that's so important because, again, sort of going, you want to defend Portugal. Again, on Article 3, the French were landed as far up the French coast as we could put them. So they had a long way to come back and march again. Only French field guns were actually taken. There was a huge number of guns that were cast in Portugal and so forth during Junot's time, but none of those were actually taken. And most of those would have been cast iron for fortresses, which may be the source of the guns for Torres Vedras later, 2 years later. Again, you've got Articles 4 to 12, which is basically the arrangements for the embarkation, timings, etc. And the most important one, again, for the disputes side, is that commissioners were to be elected from the Portuguese, Spanish, and French to resolve any disputes, which there were some, or a number. And then finally, you've got the release of Carafa's Spanish division that was rotting in prison hulks in the Tagus. The Convention of Cintra, again, this has caused much confusion over when and where it was signed and where it was ratified and that. It was signed at Junot's headquarters at Palacio de Quintela, which is actually quite a nice restaurant, according to Gareth, on the Rua de Alcaron in Lisbon. Captain Dalrymple, which is the son of Sir Hugh Dalrymple, took it in the morning to Torres Vedras, and that's where it was signed. Neither Paget or Wellesley were actually present because they were commanding their troops. Interestingly, Paget was actually senior to Wellesley as a lieutenant general. So technically, Wellesley is correct when he didn't see the final draft, but he had been involved in every single stage up to that point. And at the meeting, there was no objections from the lieutenant generals that he had convened, Dalrymple. The Royal Navy objected to the original peace treaty that was signed by Wellesley, and this was simply sort of going if Lisbon had been a neutral port, the Royal Navy could not chase, molest, or stop any of the Russians for at least 24 hours under maritime law. So a separate naval treaty was negotiated with the Russians, and the Russian squadron arrived in Portsmouth, where it was impounded. And then a year later, the crews and officers were embarked on British transports. They arrived at Riga, which is in the Baltic coast, in 1809. Only 2 of the ships out of the 8 that were interned in Portsmouth were seaworthy, and the rest were sold and broken up. Most of the armament was also returned to Russia. This is the traditional view of Cintra. Pots of money that the French had taken from the Portuguese. It all been sort of like sorted out amongst the British, etc. So it's again sort of going. There were plenty of objections from the Portuguese. I'm not expecting you to be able to read the extract from the paper there. And again, sort of the papers are always a fascinating place to go and find out what's happening and so forth. And especially my dear co-author Sue Law enjoys herself sort of ploughing through all those papers, which is finding some wonderful stuff. Frere complained and wasn't justified. He called the British auxiliaries of Portugal. We weren't. We were there on our own power. We paid our own way, and we actually paid and armed the Portuguese. The French had honours of war. They weren't prisoners. A military convention. This was a military convention, not a civilian agreement. So the French also, remember I was talking about sort of going the horses earlier, they had right of conquest. So they were actually owned the horses, the gunpowder, and anything else that was under their charge during their rule of Portugal. The convention actually limited the number of horses embarked to only 200 staff horses and 600 saddle horses. well over 3,000 horses couldn't be embarked. They would then have to be sold or left on the quayside. Remember, Junot had not been forced to surrender, so they were not prisoners of war. We could have put the implication of sort of saying, well, you couldn't take up arms against Portugal again for this war. But everybody knew that that was a complete waste of time because you were dealing with Napoleon, who would ignore all of that. The French were forced to give back most of their plunder. And again, sort of going, the plunder was defined as that was obtained after the 22nd of August, 1808, and could not include art or church plate. Beresford did a wonderful job in enforcing all this, and also sort of stopped one of the sailings of the First Division sailings by a week, that forced them to give up the silver that had been minted out of church plate. The other interesting part is that Beresford re-equipped, rearmed, and gave back the horses that had been taken by the French to the Spanish, that then marched back to Badajoz. The French finally leave in British ships. Again, sort of going, this has been quite a difficult thing to try and actually work out who was actually, how many the casualties and so forth. But again, you've got over 3,000 were killed by insurgents. So that was about 3 times as many that were killed in battle at Vimeiro and Rolica. There were some prisoners of war, but a huge number of the Swiss and Germans deserted to the 5th, 60th and the KGL. And unfortunately, we had a loss of one of the ships, were wrecked on the French coast. So we've got here British objectives. We had swiftly and cheaply obtained them. We needed to remove Junot from Portugal without the need of a siege train, and quickly so Napoleon could not intervene. That had been successfully done. The other important thing for the security of Britain was the securing the important deep water port of Lisbon, which could have been used as a staging post for an invasion fleet, and especially over the winter months. Then you have the Portuguese government was now in Brazil, so it's out of the hands of the French. And also the Portuguese Navy was on the other side of the Atlantic. It also confirmed that the British Army could defeat the French in open battle. This had been questioned probably up until Maida in 1806 was, and again, sort of going, Maida's quite an interesting campaign, which I can always go and expand upon. Then you've got the Russian Navy was a threat to the trade in the Mediterranean, as well as if it got into the Atlantic, and reinforcing the Russians that were being hostile to the British at the time in the Baltic. And above all, to use Portugal as a secure base to assist the Spanish uprising against the occupation. These are some of the books that me and Sue Law, or Susan Law, have written for the Shorncliffe Trust. Again, these are more textbooks and data books and so forth, and got a huge amount of information in them. This is our latest publication. This was just been published, and I was really flattered at Rob Burnham's comment. It is a compelling read with its numerous tables, makes it a very useful reference book. It would, I will turn to it and again in my future research, which is a wonderful compliment from a really good author. Right. Any questions?
I'm sure there will be, and indeed there are, Stephen. That was absolutely wonderful and a tour de force, and we know how much detail you go into to produce your books. Can I just kick off as I'm waiting for more questions to come in, and good people do remember to use the chat function, and I'll come back and pass those questions to Stephen. But Stephen, given the furore that happened in London when the terms of Cintra were announced, and yet, as you've said, you know, we wanted the French out of Lisbon, and we hadn't got the facilities of taking the Castle San Jorge, etc. Why was there such a public outcry when, as you said, it seemed to make perfect sense?
You've got an opposition. It's again sort of going, you look at who was actually making the noise. It was the opposition. So again, sort of going, this is a political thing. You had a inquiry that completely exonerated all the members that were actually present. I mean, there was a slight Dalrymple and so forth came out not quite as good, but again, none of them were censured, none of them were court-martialed. So it's again sort of going, on the military side, it was the right decision, and it was the only decision that could be made. Politically, it could well have been actually handled a little better.
I've got a question here from Rob Hayhurst, who asks, if this was a great treaty, why did Wellesley disown it? And I think you want to share more of your ideas about what's going on in Wellesley's mind.
Right. 1805, Wellesley returned with his brother Richard from India. They had been accused of embezzling and taking funds and various things like that from India. So he had spent the previous 2-3 years defending in the House of Commons his brother Richard. So you've got that side of it. Also that he saw the political repercussions of sort of going, well, we haven't actually captured the French. So he saw that side. So again, it was a political reaction to it. And again, the other side is, remember, he was 121 in the list of generals. It was sort of going, he was completely sidelined because he was, with the generals that were in there, I think he was 7th or 8th in line of command of the generals that were present in the Portugal at the time. So you got all those various things happening, and also that he needed and wanted to actually control the media. The other side is that, of course, he was pelted with rotten eggs and so forth on his travels back to London, sort of from it. So he reacted to that. There's a lot of sort of reasonings and so forth with Wellesley, but again, Wellesley was always very selective in his writings.
I'm going to pick up a question, and this relates to what you were telling me when we did the practice session on what happened to Dalrymple and Bullard. But someone with the name Trillium has actually sent a question. Do you know why there was a delay in sending the treaty to England? I understand the king rebuked Dalrymple.
There really wasn't that much of a delay. You're talking about a couple of days delay. It had to be translated, had to be confirmed, had to be copied. Remember, you had no photocopiers, you had no cameras. So you've got those problems. And also Dalrymple needed to go and write a dispatch. And then you've got to go and get the tides right, and so forth. He had only just confirmed it on the 31st of August. And the actual message was sent on the 3rd of September. So you're not talking about very much time at all. And then, of course, it took 2 weeks to get back to London. What they were complaining about was sort of going, they weren't consulted before they actually did the convention. But practically, you couldn't do that because the French were sitting there going, we're going to get murdered here. And they needed to get out. And you're talking about a month getting information backwards and forwards and getting agreements and so forth. Again, I don't think anybody in the government thought that we would have been as successful as we were at ejecting the French out of Portugal in less than a month.
Could I just ask you, you shared with me before what happened to Dalrymple and what happened to Burrard and the reasons. Could you share those with us?
Dalrymple, unfortunately, was ill, and so he requested to go back to London. If Burrard had actually been well, he would have still been CNC in Portugal.
Right.
So
the illness, So Dalrymple, would it be true to say Dalrymple is sacrificed, but Burrard, because of his illness, if he hadn't been ill, then he could have become CNC.
He would have been CNC, I would have expected, in Portugal. That would have left the likes of Wellesley or Moore and so forth to then take the field army. So he would be in command at home in the same way as Craddock later was commander in Portugal. And again, sort of going, you've got Wellesley again in the Talavera campaign, was actually in command of the field army because he was in command in Spain. So that's how you would have had that.
Great, thank you. Andrew Dismos asked a question. We are looking from the British perspective. What did Napoleon think of a deal?
He was pleased in a way in that he didn't have to go and execute or court-martial his friend Junot, because the British were doing a wonderful job at sort of trying to actually sort of like prosecute their generals. So politically, Napoleon was able to not have to censure Junot. But in effect, that's what he did. He sidelined him for just about everything and only sort of used him again, really sort of like back in 1812, when he had another problem not choosing very good corps commanders. So ended up Junot in command of the corps of Westphalian Corps. Junot's a tremendously interesting character to sort of look at. But no, Napoleon was incensed, enraged. Basically going, he should have, Junot should have locked himself up in Elvas and Almeida and so forth, and waited until Napoleon had come and rescued him. And that could quite easily have happened.
Right, thank you. I'm going to move on. I've got various questions on the Russian squadron issue. So I've got a question from Gareth here. Am I right in thinking that the Russian fleet sailed to Portsmouth under their own flag, and as the ships were in too bad a condition to sail home in 1813, the British gave Russia the value of replacing the ships brand new?
Yes.
That was a short answer. Thank you. I shall move on as we go through. Again, to Trillium, is it possible to get a copy of the slideshow? I missed the first 15 slides. Yes, as you know, we're recording this. Owen will then work his wonder on topping and tailing, and we will put it on a members zone of our website. So allow us about 3 weeks, and then you'll be able to access that easily. Code, of course, is in the journal.
But also, I can actually send you, John, the final slides.
Okay, super. I've got a question for Paul Chamberlain now. Were the French wounded from Vimeiro included in the convention? General Pilet, who was wounded at that battle, was sent to England as a POW, but maintained he should have been sent back to France alongside Junot's troops.
That's an interesting question. Basically going, they should have been. I really think that the Frenchman was actually perfectly in his rights. That it included, because there was about 3,500 wounded and sick, and so in Lisbon. So it should have actually meant that any of those should have been repatriated back to France. But again, it depends upon the time and depends upon how willing Napoleon was to receive. So you've got both sides of the problems of sort of repatriating wounded and so forth. But I do agree. I think he should have been repatriated back to France.
And I think that ties in with another question from Andrew on the same subject. So that's fantastic. Now, I've got a message from Jerry here, but I'm not too sure on the wording there. Jerry, if you can resend that to me, that would be absolutely fine. Stephen, that's all the questions we've got, but would you say a little bit more about the book? Because obviously it's out now, you and Sue's book, and there you are. Thank you very much. Moore and Wellington, War in the Baltic, Mediterranean, Portugal, 1805 to 1808. This is your sales pitch, sir. Away you go.
It's a huge undertaking. Again, sort of going what we would written this as an intermediate, because this is the first volume we did together, was Sir John Moore and the Universal Soldier, which probably tells you a lot more about the British Army, how light infantry worked, and so forth. It's not a classic biography. And again, it sort of goes through and looks at the training and the importance of the Dundas regulations. And there's 19 pages by Dundas, which basically tells you how light infantry are actually going to be used. So that's important. And we were using this as a, this goes up, the Universal Soldier goes up to 1805. And this was taking the period from 1805 to 1808 before we get into the Moore's invasion of Spain and then his retreat. We didn't expect it to be quite as large a book as we ended up. We've got 144,000 words, and I was expecting about 80,000 words. So Sue outdid herself. But also I couldn't actually cut anything from there because there's some very, very interesting leads and so forth. We've only done part of them looking at the Royal Navy, but you've also got logistics, you've also got the political side, you've also got the trade. And trade is so important. If you don't understand British trade at the time, you don't really understand the actions or why. Why are we in Sicily? Well, Sicily is because that's where the sulfur comes from. And sulfur is required for gunpowder. And the importance of India. So again, there's all those things that we just need to sort of pull together. Then going through the seniority and listing down all the generals that were could have been actually used by the British and so forth. And again, going through the problems of getting enough men to be able to put onto the continent and have a disposable force. So you've got all those sort of like trains that all coming together.
Great, super. And what then follows? Because is this the case then? But you then go on and deal with Sir John Moore. Is this what's happening next?
Yes. I mean the next thing is sort of Sue is busily hammering away on Sir John Moore and the invasion of Portugal. And remember, this only started in sort of October, so you've got very, very little time. He only barely a week before he was commander of the British Army in Spain. He'd only been in command for a week before the invasion started. So you've got all those things, and also sort of going, still sorting out why you would even consider going to war in winter. You're now outside the campaign season. They started in October, and that's normally when you sort of like go back to your go back to garrison duty and so forth, and do nothing, because again, the weather in certain parts of Spain and so forth are atrocious, as can be seen from the retreat to Corunna. So that's where we will be going, and that's probably going to take us a few years to go and put together. In the UK, you can get from Brilliance in Berlin, or from On Military Matters in US, and there's an Italian bookshop as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. As you could see, comments coming in. Paul Chamberlain, fascinating talk. Thank you. Vic Powell, thanks, Stephen. Very informative as always. Andrew Wright, thank you, Stephen. Fabulous. Adrian Clark, a very thought-provoking talk. Thank you. So, good people, that is the first of our 7 lectures. The next one will be the 14th of December. You can already book it. Indeed, 60 odd people already have on Eventbrite. And this will be Professor Luke Reynolds. He's not spoken to us before, but assistant visiting professor at Stanford, so hopefully we'll get the technology to work on that occasions. Let's hope we can get through to Connecticut. And he's talking about, in a way, about the other end of the timeline. He's published a book, OUP, on who owned Waterloo, and this is the impact of the Battle of Waterloo itself on British culture at all sorts of different levels, and 1815 to 1852. So that promises to be a real treat and will be also thought-provoking. So I look forward to seeing you then. I hope you're all enjoying the journal that's come out. Marvellous piece of work by Paul Brunier, as always. We've been very much inundated by this idea of doing a one-day, doing a whole weekend looking at one day, i.e. the 18th of June, 1815 at Waterloo. So already about between a third and a half of all the places have gone. So if you are umming and ahhing, don't and ah anymore. Send me an email. Otherwise, there won't be a place. Anyway, it only leaves me to thank very, very much Dr. Stephen Summerfield, for that thought-provoking talk, which is what we wanted when we actually got the first of our lecture season. So, Stephen, as always, our very grateful thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.